come back to my other argument about the other voices of reconciliation, of a need for shared values if we are to survive on this planet. I think these voices are too infrequently heard in an age of video malaise, where news of violence, suffering, and agony drive out any appreciation for human caring. We are being inundated with the grim predictions of the apostles of despair, whom Philip Gurevich in the New Yorker earlier this month, on 8 April, and it's a beautiful piece, called the misfortune tellers, whom he identified as Samuel Huntington of Harvard in his Clash of Civilizations argument, Benjamin Barber in Jihad versus McWorld, and Robert Kaplan in The Coming Anarchy. For all of them, the West is at bay against the threat of tribalism and violence, of Islamic fundamentalism and anarchy. As Gurevich points out, for them, hell is other people. There is no analysis of the diversity of the human condition and problems, no sense of history. For them, the world is a malevolent place, crowded with people prone to viciousness. These authors serve, he said, merely as symptoms of the age they propose to diagnose. They are selling fear and not understanding. Now, this lecture series has brought many who stand against this new effort at dividing this planet again into hostile categories of we and they, superior and inferior, those who are inside and those who are outside, with mutually exclusive identities based on reified human categories, and not on a shared sense of empathy over pain and suffering, and the need to find shared identities and relatedness if we are to find our way out of the deep contradictions of the late modern condition. So I end my formal remarks.
Okay, the floor is open for questions. Just a reminder that the sound acoustics are very poor in this room, so those people who are asking a question, please rise from your seat and project your voice as clearly as possible. And I'll identify you as I see your hands emerge. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm not a political scientist, but I do have my personal view on political Islamic or fundamentalism.
I'm no authority on the subject, I assure you.
You mainly discussed the fundamentalists, and you did mention actually that the media wrongfully interchangeably use extremism and fundamentalism and militancy, and they all mean the same thing to them. And you discussed the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, but what you mentioned the Muslim movement or the Muslim Brotherhood movement. In my opinion, the militants or the extremism, the Islamic fundamentalism, this was a movement for reform or for greater independence or for cooperation about between Muslim countries, or did not believe in the division of the Muslim states. And in my opinion, this was a successful idea, and those mainstream, or I would say moderate Islamic movements have shown some success, like in Turkey, for example, or some other places like in Egypt. And the West was afraid of this popularity, and so they wanted to paint them or try to create some sort of movement to paint all of them as bad. So that's why they carve the creation of extremism, militancy. And then just paint all of them just like as one people or just the same.
Could you get to a question?
Well, I just my opinion.
Okay. I share fully what you're saying.
There would have been no movement in Algeria. Militancy was there not. Like the main reason here is that the political Islamists, they are deprived of political integration, which is caused by the US, or by the West. And for this, we see the creation of this militancy. If they become part of the political process, I would say that this problem would go away
Let me just make one comment on your beginning point. I don't think very few of the Islamists take the transnational ummah view that you're talking about. In fact, political Islam buys into the territorial state much more than the Muslim community in general does, because the focus on control of the state is not some other created state, it's the ones they've inherited. I think that's a weakness, frankly, in the movement, which is much stronger as something beyond boundaries of state and religion transcending the limitations of the territorial state. That would be the only point. Now, having said that, it's not all the West's misrepresentation. There is a deep division in the Muslim community about how to deal with this particular new form of political ideology. And whereas there are a lot of very good things to say about it, there are also some real points of dispute that are not simply borrowing the West's characterization of it. There are some really serious debates here, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was once proposed in some doctoral theses in Europe, I don't have the record, that the clash between Jews and Germans was logically necessary because both people claimed they were number one. The question, can it be argued that this collision between Islam and the West, by the West arguing the United States, logically necessary because they both claim to be the rulers of the world, the new world order?
No, I wouldn't see it that way. I can see where your argument is coming from. No, I guess I don't read that kind of triumphalism in that particular way on the Muslim side.
Why the West and Islam? Why not the West and Buddhism, for instance?
I know, because we're talking about the Muslim community. As I was said, it never went away. This is no resurgence. All we've simply seen is that this community, which has remained deeply Muslim for the last 1,300 years, is now visible on the world stage. And so the fact that they didn't go out and choose this in order to defeat the United States, but it takes on a particular representation about the domination, but it's not the United States, it's secularism. And in that sense, I mean, I can be equally opposed to the United States sitting here in North America.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much again for your eloquent presentation. I would like to suggest another point that may be contributing to the understanding of so-called resurgence of Islam. Maybe there is an element that, due to injustice being imposed on the Muslims as individuals, both in their understanding and injustice in their treatment or understanding of others. And I will take one example to illustrate that point and I'll ask your comments. In Palestine, Islam, as you very well know, wasn't very visible as it is now, or it has been for the last, say, 5 years in Palestine. And I suggest that, in part at least, due to the tremendous injustice that was imposed on Palestinians First, they were thrown out of the country, a number of them. The country was taken from them. Tremendous injustice was imposed on them individually as a community and as a community. And finally, they were called terrorists. Their leadership was from the extreme right to the extreme left. The alliance of the extreme left is no more, and the extreme right started to accept this injustice as fair. And as a result, Palestinians have no option, or a great number of them, but to go to the supernatural. And therefore, there was a more visible Islam in Palestine. Would that contribute to the understanding?
Oh, enormously so. In fact, I could have written the whole lecture if you talk about failures of foreign policy on the particular question of Israel, which looms enormously large in this discussion, and not just simply among Palestinians. This has been a major question throughout the whole Muslim community, not even just the Arab world, on the nature of that injustice. There's no question that's had very deep echoes, and more in the street than it has been among the secular state leaders in this country, which has caused in this part of the world, which I think has caused the problem. I know I agree entirely with what you're saying. There's one answer to that, of course, is that the original response to this was a secular nationalist movement, but it was led by a man who isn't at all secular. So you're already into one of these curious kinds of elements. In fact, I had recently an Iranian student who worked for the Iranian news agency for 7 years, and his job was covering Palestine and all of Arafat's speeches. And a cult grew up in Tehran of Arafat's speeches, because there were far more references to the Quran in Arafat's work than there was in any Ayatollah in Iran.
Nasser, go ahead. Yeah.
The Muslim country, they have very good relation with the non-Muslim. If you look at the history of the Muslim country, if there is no one wants to believe in Islam, they are free. Just they pay a amount of the money a year to be paid free.
Which hasn't been collected for about 400 years, you know.
My question is, any Western, they come to the undeveloped country, the first they say we are going to develop your country, but they bring the arm, they bring the violence, they disrupt the country. No, the people of those countries are not live anymore. They believe their religion as a religion, but when they even some priests, they go to Africa to show the people the way, but they want a spy or they want a ally for the Western.
I share that point of view in terms of the historical record. I think you're quite right. Among students of comparative literature, I mean, Islam stands out by its sense of not imposing that sharp boundary of self and other. You know, that there are those who share part of the same vision. You know, that's an enormous source of wisdom, I would argue. I think Christians are the worst at this, actually.
The murder of the two Hamas leaders.
No, one jihad, one Hamas.
One jihad, one Hamas. Are we to believe that these are rogue males in the Mossad making this decision? Surely such a decision is made at the very top. And if this is so, how can the leadership at the top in Israel be so flawed in their thinking and not to know what a disastrous acts those?
You don't think I'm going to explain? They just gave us Operation Grapes of Wrath as well. I mean, if you can tell me what the rationale and logic of that in a period of building peace It is such an enormous contradiction that I can't imagine what the rationale lies, other than it's an election campaign and all that counts is the internal voices, the self, and others are hell. The same kind of view.
So they, John, they feel free to risk generations of.
Well, I don't see it that way. I mean, the argument is, you hear it over and over again, the Arabs only, how many times have we heard this? The other side only understands force. You really don't understand these people, that's all you got to coerce them. Once they understand who's in charge, that's how you get peace. Right? Well, it's not the first time we've heard that.
Yes, I have a couple of comments to make. One is that often when we study Islam, we do not study it on its own merit. We try to compare it with other religions and then draw parallels. And we make mistakes if we do that. Because they're not mistakes. And second, is that Muslim communities such as ours in Canada or in the US, none of the researchers often goes to these people and finds out where do they stand, what's their understanding of Islam, and what's their interpretation. And again, we go to an interpretation of one person who may have lived somewhere else or may have motivated by certain ideas or whatever, and come to a conclusion that is Islam. So what's your comment on that?
Well, I think your point is extremely well taken, and I would plead only guilty to parts of that, and saying I try to read as many Muslim voices and to listen to as many as I can on it. But the point is extremely well taken.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My question is, what, in your opinion, is the future of political Islam? This is especially in reference to the fact that, despite having widespread popularity among the Egyptians, the Muslim Brotherhood has been unable to gain power in the last 6 decades. Similarly, the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan has been unable to gain power for the last 8 decades. This clearly proves a point that Islam and politics has been a clear failure. Can you please comment on that?
Well, what about Iran and Sudan?
The bloody revolution, not politics.
Well, no, the politics. I mean, we make our judgment about it, but you can't say that it's been, I mean, certainly the Iranian Revolution stands as an enormous victory for one version of political Islam. And I'm not saying it is shared in terms of its version, but it's not true that, and I think in answer to your question, there is the likelihood, and I mentioned Algeria, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, each of which is powerful echoes in the region. I happen to think the Saudi case is the one that's the most fragile, unlike, and the Americans are contributing enormously to undermining the remaining fragile legitimacy after Desert Storm of the Saudi regime. And that seems odd because you could argue, but what is in Saudi Arabia is traditional Islam. It's not political Islam.
Sohail?
Thanks very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask a broad question as well. I'd like you to talk about the role women have played in shaping political Islam. And to what extent, and it's an assumption that they are contributing to their own oppression within political Islam.
Wow.
It's a very broad question.
Well, I set out my views that one of my strong reservations is particularly on the patriarchal dimension that characterizes each of these Abrahamic faiths. As a matter of fact, when they come to this political version. And as you well know, it's not simply opposing feminism as secularism to that, because there is a very vigorous and lively movement of Islamic feminists who have a great deal to say about the authenticity of remaining within an Islamic tradition and talking about emancipation which is possible within a continuing debate against practices introduced which the Islamic feminists say are un-Islamic. and that there is a patriarchal element, but don't blame it on the religion, blame it on the importation of practice. And you're familiar with the voices. I quoted Fatima Mernissi among others, but there are many. Laila Hoffman, I mean, there's a huge number. And I think their particular concern is that it's very hard to find that emancipatory space within the engineers' dominated view of Islam. And I say that, I don't want to get into a quarrel with the engineers here. I'm from a family of engineers. I'm 1 out of 10. And so this quarrel goes on all the time. I mean, get an engineer on politics. You know. And I'm saying that's a particularly, I mean, even in the faculties, it still remains the most unemancipated on gender. And so these things are part of a much larger package, and it's not Islam. And in that sense, I have my quarrel with the secular feminists, Arab and Muslim. Of course, you know, here's a funny thing. What in the world is a secular Muslim? I mean, it can't be. It's an oxymoron. It's a secular Christian, and yet we talk about secular Jews having created the state of Israel and all this. I mean, as Akiva Orr, who's one of the leading radical voices in Israel, says, you know, Israel's not, this is not a Jewish state. These are Hebrew-speaking Gentiles. Because no, I mean, there's no such thing, he says, as a secular Jew. And why do we accept that kind of identification question? It's back into all of these things about where in the debate can be situated. I think it's one of the most sensitive questions of all. I didn't say enough about it, but you saw clearly that one of my reservations, despite all the other things I support in terms of filling the vacuum, particularly the strong social programs, which are an incredible success story because they have something to do with motivation and community. Unlike the welfare state. I mean, look around at the whole welfare state of the late 20th century everywhere. I mean, the motivation is a problem. The sense of community is a problem. The delivery of social services in the hands of the state everywhere raises problems. That's why I have my difficulty with political Islam. So then they want to control the state? I think they're doing much better by staying outside the state.
In the back, yeah, go ahead.
The first big international crisis I ever remember of Dr. Sigler was the overthrow of the Nouri al-Said regime in Iraq in 1958 with the subsequent invasion of Lebanon by the Grand Alliance. And I wanted to ask you what circumstances would be necessary to unlock the Western grip over the Middle East. I mean, supposing the governments of Egypt, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia were to fall at once as, say, like in 1918 or something like that, what would the options be open to the United States in particular? What could they do? What are they thinking about now if this does occur?
Well, you've seen what happened in the case of Iran. I mean, we've been through this once, and the usual answer is they don't cope with it, but then treat it as a pariah state. And so they try and mount the rest of the world in dual containment and no dialogue and no sense of change. But I don't know. Those are enormously huge scenarios. But let me just respond in another way. I just did a paper which I presented in Jordan. Actually, I should tell you about this conference was at Al-Bayt, which is this new Jordanian answer to Al-Azhar. It's a university in the desert with 4,000 students, almost all of whom come from non-Arab Muslim countries. So that the languages of instruction are Urdu, Malaysian, Indonesian, Turkish, Farsi. It's absolutely fascinating. And look what they're trying to do. These are the objectives of most of them are women, incidentally. They had 100 Bosnian women.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.
you.